The National Prosecuting Authority continues to be under intense scrutiny amid growing criticism of its recent performance. Just this week, Action SA led a march to the Department of Justice in Pretoria, calling for Minister Mamoloko Kubayi to engage President Cyril Ramaphosa to initiate a formal process for the removal of the National Director of Public Prosecutions, Shamila Batohi. At the heart of the party's complaint is sluggish progress in the prosecution of corruption cases emanating from the work of the Zondo Commission into state capture. At the same time, the NPA boss has appeared before the Standing Committee on Public Accounts this week, alongside the heads of the Special Investigating Unit and the Directorate for Priority Crime Investigation, DPCI, the Hawks, to account for systemic issues affecting their performance on corruption and other sophisticated and complex crimes. So let's speak now to Dr. Jean Redpath, who is senior researcher at the Della Oma Institute for Constitutional Law, and that is at the University of the Western Cape. Good afternoon, and thank you for your time, Doc. So just your reflections then of what we heard in the last few days about what's behind some of the delays we are seeing, from the promise of having people in orange overalls to now talking about issues of whether or not we have capacity within the various institutions. But of course, your work has focused mostly on the NPA.
Yes, and I think that the NPA is absolutely crucial in the accountability chain of holding people to account for state capture and for the corruption that occurred over the last 10 to 15 years. But we have to be very careful of distinguishing the NPA as an institution and the work of people within that institution, as well as the constitutional and legislative structure in which the NPA finds itself, which it was not able to withstand state capture during those times. And so that really tells us that there is something lacking in the legislative framework for the NPA. And we really have to look at that very closely. When it comes to the delays, we cannot only look at the NPA for the causes of delay. Cases are investigated, except for a very small number, which have now only recently been allocated to the IDAC, the Investigating Directorate Against Corruption in the NPA. Previously to that, the investigations were in the police. So a case cannot be unrolled until the investigation is complete and the prosecution has decided to prosecute. Then we enter the court process. And what we've seen in our court system is that the 2 years of COVID lockdown, in which many of our courts actually ceased to operate, have been devastating to the timelines that we see not only in serious cases, but in less serious cases. Timelines have doubled. So matters that used to take 3 years are now taking 6 years.
Sure.
And added to that, the number of magistrates and judges has not really changed in 15 years. We know that the number of people in the country has changed, that the pressure on the system has increased, but we're trying to do it all with the same amount of people. And what that leads to inevitably is inefficiencies. We see our courts not sitting for the number of hours that they could, because there simply aren't enough magistrates to hold those spaces. And then we see cases taking ever and ever longer, and the number of postponements simply not being within the realm of what is reasonable and within what the Chief Justice has actually directed should take place.
I'm keen to get into the factors that are at play as far as the delays are concerned, but there's something you said that I find quite interesting, and I think I should pull at that thread around what you're saying. Something is lacking in the legislative framework of the NPA. What do you mean by that? What's lacking?
So there are civil society and the National Director herself have actually pointed to a number of problems in the legislative framework. One is how the top echelon of the NPA is selected and appointed. At the moment, the legislation says it's the president who decides. Now, the last time the National Director was appointed in a consultative process, that was good, and we hope to see that again. But we need that to be embedded in legislation. Second, and we need it for the directors of prosecution who are in charge of the provinces as well. Secondly, the directors of prosecution serve until age 65. And for some of them who are very young, that means they serve for a very long time, and the dynamism is lacking. Then what we also have is we had a very strange, there's a thing called occupational specific dispensation where salaries are adjusted. That was done in a very strange way in the NPA. I won't go into detail because it's quite complicated,
Sure.
But it had the effect of having some of the most senior prosecutors earning less than junior prosecutors. And this obviously really undermined morale. And we also saw huge vacancies arise in some of the key parts of the NPA. When you're looking at vacancies of 17 to 20% in certain programs, that institution cannot function properly.
Yeah.
Then we have what would ameliorate that would be if the National Director could bring in resources from the outside as and when is needed. And that's not only for legal skills, but also for investigative skills now that the IDAC has the mandate for the state capture cases. But that process, in terms of Section 38 of the Act, is bureaucratic and burdensome, requires the Minister's agreement, requires the Director General's agreement, requires the Minister of Finance to be involved, and it's really acted as a bottleneck to the NPA. Plus, there isn't a budget for those kinds of appointments, as and when extra skills are needed in specific cases.
So let me ask you then, Dr. Redpath, when you heard the claim that was made initially by the NDPP of infiltration by certain people who are, in a way, undermining the work of the NPA, what did you make of that? Of course, she's backtracked from that and has said that perhaps it was the wrong choice of words. And what she meant was that there are people who perhaps are not aligned with the values of the NPA. To what extent does that reflect the reality, either or, infiltration or people who don't align with the values of the NPA?
Well, she's absolutely right that one of the challenges on arriving in 2019 was that she didn't know who was to be trusted and who wasn't. And we've seen a lot of people being moved around, being asked to resign over this time. But without doubt, it hasn't covered everybody. And then at the lower levels of the organization, what we're starting to see, which we didn't see previously, was perceptions amongst the public, amongst magistrates, that there is some degree of corruption. And we heard this week of a former prosecutor who was involved in fraud, using the institution of the court to offer people positions as prosecutors, taking their money and then nothing coming of it. So there clearly are people in the NPA who are bad eggs, and she's being honest about that, and I think that is great. And there is there's a new ethics office in the NPA which is supposed to identify and root out those people.
Doc, I've got to rush and just jump in because of time. I wanted to just throw in this question about, we've seen these calls that are saying, for instance, from Action SA, that are saying the president should initiate this process to investigate, inquire into the NDPP's fitness to hold office. What purpose would it serve? Would that solve anything given where we are with her tenure?
It would solve absolutely nothing. In fact, it would make things worse because there would be uncertainty. The process for appointing a new NDP, she's supposed to resign, not resign, but her term comes to an end in early next year. So all it will do is create disruption and uncertainty, and you have to wonder what are the underlying motives for that kind of call. There's no doubt that the NDPP is a person of integrity and has been doing her best in very, very difficult times in a very constrained legislative framework.
All right, I've got to thank you for your time. That's Dr. Jean Redpath, who is Senior Researcher at the Della Omar Institute for Constitutional Law, and that is at the University of the Western Cape.